Good morning, and welcome to today's discussion, So Rich, So Poor, Why It Is So Hard to End Poverty in America. I am LaShawn Warren, Vice President for Policy Development and Programming at the American Constitution Society for Law and Policy. For those of you who are unfamiliar with ACS, we are a national network of lawyers, law students, judges, and policymakers who believe that the law should be a force to improve the lives of all people. Today, we are thrilled to co-sponsor this morning's conversation featuring our esteemed board chair, Professor Peter Edelman. It is our mission at ACS to ensure that the fundamental principles of human dignity, genuine equality, and individual rights and liberty enjoy their rightful and central place in American law. Professor Edelman's book, So Rich, So Poor, presents a timely opportunity to discuss how our country can be so wealthy yet face such dramatic economic and political inequality. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, more than 46 million Americans now live in poverty. Today, 1 in 5 children in this country are living in poverty. More than half of African Americans, more than a quarter of African Americans, Hispanic Americans, live below the poverty line, which we define as having an income of only $22,000 a year for a family of 4, and just $11,000 for an individual. The economic recession has devastated the middle class as well. The past half-decade has seen the median household income fall each year, now resting at $49,000 per year. Adjusted for inflation, middle-class families only earn 11% more now than they did in 1980. Meanwhile, the richest Americans have seen their income expand by over 40%. As Professor Edelman explains, as long as middle-income voters think they have more in common with the 1% and that social mobility is realistically available for themselves and their children, it will be hard for our nation to reverse course and truly combat poverty. To help us tease out some of these issues and how best to confront this challenge, we are pleased to have with us Professor Peter Edelman, the author of So Rich, So Poor, along with Heather Boucher, who is a senior economic advisor at the Center for American Progress. She focuses on employment, social policy, and family economic well-being. And then finally, we have with us Linda Wertheimer, one of my favorite. Linda is the senior national correspondent at the National Public Radio, known as NPR. A career spanning more than 4 decades, she has seen our nation experience not just the pain of the Great Recession, but also the benefits of our great society. Please join me in welcoming our panelists for this morning's discussion.
Thank you very much, and thank you all very much for coming. I'm sort of running interference here more than anything else. I don't have anything like a statement, and we're not giving these guys much room for a statement either. So we're just going to start with questions, if that's all right. This book is very impressive, and I have to say, very depressing book, is blessedly brief, so that if you're have those sorts of concerns about reading a really hard book like this, don't. It's a wonderfully readable book with a lot of shared history in it, and I found it wonderful. So I recommend the book to you. And let me just start with you, Peter, and ask you. You have spent 40 years laboring in the wilderness of poverty, and yet you do not despair. I think that's one of the most extraordinary things that I know about you. But what you do tell us in this book is that poverty has grown steadily worse in the past decade for reasons including but not limited to the Great Recession. Why?
We were making holding our own on poverty, Linda, and thank you for doing this today. It's wonderful, and thanks to CAP and ACS and my dear friend Heather. The first kind of piece of set of facts that I would kind of put on the table in getting to the last decade is where we were from the 60s, but quickly, to the beginning of this century, because you have kind of two sets of facts that seem inconsistent. You have the fact that we did a lot, and indeed it's a major reason why I do stay optimistic. We did a lot to reduce poverty in this country, to attack poverty, and are still doing those things. And so the whole list from Social Security on is keeping 40 million people out of poverty. That 46 million number would be that much larger. The paradox is that with all of that and keeping 40 million people out of poverty, the percentage of people in poverty at the end of the Clinton administration was 11.3, and back at the sort of best time we ever had on poverty, it was 11.1% in 1973. So how could those two things be true? All of that good public policy and essentially at the end of that almost 30-year period then be in about the same place. And the answer is because there were such fundamental changes in the economy with a huge flood of low-wage jobs and changes in family structure with so many single moms out looking for a job and being the only possible wage earner in their house. And as a consequence, you have 47% of households that are headed by a single mom with children in poverty. It's an astonishing number. So that's the kind of context for your question. We couldn't be satisfied then, but in the last 12 years, we've seen two pieces of this. One, 6 million more people during the Bush period up to the beginning of the recession added to the rolls because there wasn't a particular effort to do better, although there wasn't a particular effort to do worse either. The Bush administration was actually good on food stamps. And then this recession, which has just been devastating for people all the way at the bottom, for people who are in regular poverty, and really for working people of all levels. So when we hear a lot of talk about the middle class, which is correct, we also need to have what I'm trying to say here, and what I think more people should, which is that our concern has to go all the way down to the bottom, all of the 99%, if you will.
Heather, what about you? Why do you think that we've, apart from the recession, which of course is a huge element?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that reading this book that Peter put together, it is such a lovely exposition of an answer to that question. I read a lot of things that are not so easy to digest in terms of putting all of the numbers together, and these very depressing numbers with a lot of, quite frankly, delightful indignation, if that makes sense. That, just sort of pointing out just how wrong this is and how it is in our capacity to change it. And I mean, so Peter's outlined, I think, quite eloquently the story of what's happened, but to put it into a slightly different words, right? What we know is that from about the time in the mid-1970s, something happened to male wages and to male employment opportunities and to men's wages. You saw a lack of income growth in terms of male wages. The only reason that families continued to see income growth was because of the added contribution of wives' income. They worked more, they added to family income. We've talked a lot here at the Center for American Progress about how wives and mothers are the new breadwinners. Today, about 60% of mothers are either a breadwinner or a co-breadwinner for their family, and that was both women moving into the workforce because men weren't making as much, but also many women moving in because they wanted to. So there was both a push and a pull going on there at the same time. So that's one, right? It's just what was happening with wages. But then, as Peter mentioned, you also had you've had this enormous shift in family structure. Many more single-parent households, and if you aren't having wages rise, you're not going to be able to support a family on a single income, be it a male income or a female income. And what I like best actually about the book is that poverty is this enormous problem, and in our country, it is first and foremost a problem about it's a problem about work. We expect people to work for a living, and if you can't access a decent job, you're going to have this problem of poverty. And then if you don't help people who basically they're unable to work or can't work, then we have the kinds of problems that Peter outlines in So Rich, So Poor.
There have been considerable efforts to improve health care for children, and efforts to reform education for children to help move children out of poverty. But still, you can't overcome the fact that you outline. I mean, you support so strongly in your book that children are the largest group of people in poverty now, and that they are there because their parents cannot provide them with the support they need.
This is a story, Linda, that has a good part before we get to the bad part, which is that the elderly and children crisscrossed back in the early 70s. The elderly used to be the poorest age group, and it's a huge public policy success. And we have to underline in the conversation that there's so many things that we do that make a huge difference. Ronald Reagan, we fought a war against poverty and poverty won. Just not true. So because of the indexing of Social Security and Supplemental Security Income, SSI, and the effects of Medicare, even though we don't measure that in income terms, the elderly, lots of elderly poverty, but are better off than they were and are poor at a lower rate than the general population. Meantime, just what Heather and I have talked about, as you elicited in the first question, all of the low-wage work means the children are going to be poor. It's the income of the parents that determines their poverty. And so they've become the poorest age group. They're poorer at a higher rate than the population generally, now up to 22% in the last year in 2010. And the reason for that is all of this low-wage work. Now, if you take public benefits into account and you look carefully at it, in fact, public benefits are helping. Not enough, but and in the case of which we'll get to, temporary assistance for needy families, what's happened to welfare, it's absolutely awful. It's basically gone in this country. But food stamps is helping with families with children as well as others. You implied or mentioned the Children's Health Insurance Program, CHIP, the Earned Income Tax Credit, really important for children where there's work in the household. So family has a job, mom has a minimum wage job, brings in about $15,000. She has 2 kids, adds over $5,000 to income. So those things have to be taken into account. But still, we are not doing what we should be doing, and children are the group who really suffer the most.
And women, Heather, that's the other group that seems sort of stubbornly stuck.
Well, and the two are so often connected. I mean, on the one hand, you can talk about, so children are poor, right? They're under this poverty threshold, which is relatively low, in terms of, I don't know what the poverty threshold is this year, but I don't know off the top of my head on a podium.
I think it's up to 23
it's about
for a family of 4
something
this
like
year,
that.
yeah.
But it's this relatively low threshold. So you've got these children that are actually in poverty, and their parents may or may not be. It's hard. It's a bit hard for 2 parents to be working full time, full year, to be living below that threshold. And so what you're seeing is that part of the reason you have so many children in poverty is because workplaces are actually so hostile to people that have care responsibilities, children or caring for other people, that puts parents into this untenable choice between keeping this job or doing the right thing by their family. And so a couple of examples, which I think and then I'll get to the issue of women. You know, we see a lot of people who've lost their job because their kid got sick and they don't have access to paid sick days. So you've got this parent who's in this untenable choice between, well, I've got daycare, but I can't send my child to daycare with the flu, so I need to stay home with this kid, but actually I don't have the right to not go into my job because I don't have paid sick days. So you've got this parent who's struggling, and that parent is going to be more likely, that worker, to be fired than other kinds of workers, which is then going to add to this problem of poverty because you don't have workplaces that acknowledge that most workers have care responsibilities. At the same time, you've got a lot of workplaces with very severe scheduling uncertainty. So in a lot of retail or service sector jobs, people don't find out their schedule until Thursday or Friday for a work week that starts on Sunday or Monday. If you're trying to pay for childcare, that childcare provider, they need to know when your kid's going to be there. And if your schedule's fluctuating a lot, that can cause these great disconnects between what families need. And so that then creates a situation where you've got more parents unable to work and living in poverty, which adds to our child poverty because we don't have family-friendly workplaces. And certainly for women who are struggling with these work-family conflict issues, it is an issue that it continues to affect women more than men. You know, although we're seeing many men struggling with work-family conflict, it continues to be the case that women are more likely to experience that kind of on-the-job discrimination vis-a-vis caregiving. And of course, women continue to face a pay gap where they're making 77 cents on the dollar. And we have a Congress here in Washington that has been unwilling to take the next step to pass legislation that would increase the ability of people to do something about discrimination on the job. So all of these together make it hard for women to earn a decent day's pay and hard for them to keep their jobs even if they have them. So as we're thinking about poverty, sort of understanding that disconnect between what families need and what the workplace is providing is a key part of the problem.
And I just want to add a footnote to that, Heather, which is the basic point that the child care assistance that we have that's financed by the federal government reaches only 1 in 7 of those who are eligible. So that just is an important fact undergirding everything that you said. And of course, the whole question you asked about child poverty, and we can get into this later on, but the question of children is also a question of investing in children. It's a question of education, which goes beyond the current question, but also insofar as we're talking about young children, it's not just child care, it's developmental.
Yep.
It's investing in children because it's such a key, and we know only more, we know so much more now about the consequences for children of not having had the proper stimulation and the proper support before they start school, being ready for school. And so pre-K and really well beyond child care in terms of strong child development. We're just not there. We're far from it.
Now, Peter, you make the obvious point that a hot economy would be the best cure for this situation. That if we had a full employment economy, we would be able to look with much more compassion toward people who really do need help. But can you envision an economy in which there are sufficient good jobs to employ the American workers?
I'm very worried about that. There are certainly work that produces a decent income is at the heart of an anti-poverty strategy. Income maintenance is essentially a safety net. That's not the heart of the strategy. So there are a lot of things we want to talk about investing in children, but basically, if we're talking about income, it's income from work and it's having a decent safety net. On the work side, it absolutely begins with our macroeconomic policy and our trade policy and our immigration policy. There's so many larger things that go into it. But I'm very concerned, trying to have a little crystal ball about it, about what the prospects are for jobs that have a decent wage in the coming decade. We're living in a globalized economy. I think that wage pressures in China and India are going to be of some help in that competition that would allow for raising wages in this country. But if you go through what we know we can do, we can raise the minimum wage, absolutely should. It can't get us all the way there. I think we could go to $10 now. I would index it. But that doesn't get the kind of income that we're talking about. We can hope that the unions will be stronger, and for low-wage workers will be able to organize more effectively. That's kind of a tough sell, at least at the moment. We certainly can talk about work supports that have an income equivalent. We talked a little about child care. That's essentially money in a family's pocket. Health care has a monetary equivalent. Housing help only reaches currently the public housing and the vouchers 1 out of 4 people who have that need from an income point of view. So it's great for people, or helpful for people who get it, and help with college. All those things would help raise incomes, and we do have the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit, which are very, very important policies. I'm worried that when you get all the way up to all of those things, which is a fairly tall order in and of itself, that we're not all the way there. And I think we need a national conversation about whether there needs to be some kind of more generalized wage supplementation. You know, half the jobs in this country pay less than $34,000 a year if you have the job all year and full time. A quarter of the jobs pay less than the poverty line for a family of 4. If you're if you're a home health care worker, the average wage is less than the poverty line for a family of 4. If you're a child care worker, it's even less than that. It's less than the wage for a family of 3. So this is a huge problem, and we're just not facing up to it. And so I think that there's just got to be a lot more public discussion about how to get incomes ultimately up to a level that people can live on.
But what about the quality of jobs? What about the kinds of jobs that we keep hearing politicians say we will never have, the auto industry will never pay what the auto industry did in the 50s. We will never have that post-war wage boom again that we had. So what to do?
Yeah, and these are the most profound and important questions of our time. So, I mean, there certainly are not any easy answers. I will note, though, that we've made significant investments in the auto industry in the past couple of years as a part of the Recovery Act, and afterwards in terms of the bailing out of the auto industry, and that has been very successful. We've seen jobs come back, and yes, some of them have been these lower wage jobs, but we have seen that be, month after month when we get the employment data, there has been this bright spot in terms of continued growth in manufacturing jobs. So there is, the death knell I don't think has been rung yet for U.S. manufacturing or for the auto industry. But what it's going to require are a few things. We're going to have to think about focusing our economic policy, both our macro policy and our micro policy, on creating those kinds of jobs. And we've been thinking a lot, very deeply about that here at the Center for American Progress, about what drives economic growth, and importantly, how creating a strong middle class and fostering less inequality actually can lays the groundwork for the kind of strong economic growth that we saw in the post-World War II era. And that, as we're sort of thinking through the policy steps there, like what do you need to do? I mean, unions are clearly a piece of the puzzle, but thinking through how our macroeconomic policy has and has not been supporting the development of a broad-based middle class, thinking about our investments in education. When economists think about economic growth, the one thing that people can almost always agree on is that what drives growth is productivity gains and human capital. that, you know, that we humans have this capacity to create new stuff and new ideas, and that's what compels our economies forward. It's part of why we think our version of capitalism is so vibrant, because we allow all of these ideas to flourish, and then we've got these iPods and whatever else we have, right? You've got this, you allow this creativity to flourish, and that creates these productivity gains. You know, everything from the fancy stuff to the shop floor to, you know, Walmart coming up with a faster distribution system and the like. But right now, we aren't making those kinds of investments in education that's going to keep the United States at the top of global competitiveness in terms of human capital development. So if you want to see job creation in the future, you want to see economic growth, we need to start focusing on, well, what are the steps we need to take to foster that kind of long-term growth? Investments in education, and Peter, as you said, I mean, one thing that many economists, and my favorite is to quote James Heckman, Nobel laureate in labor economics, by no means a left-wing radical, but has said that the most important market failure in the United States today is the inability of children to choose their parents. That increasingly in the United States, where you're born determines where you'll end up. And if you are actually, Peter has some lovely stories about issues like this in the book, you know, where a child is born, what kind of circumstances they're born into has then a big impact on where they'll end up. We may care about that because we care about those children, we care about people. But as a hard-nosed economist, there's this other very important reason why we as a society need to care about that, because the next Steve Jobs could be right now living in a low-income rural family and not have access to a decent high school education and never go to college, and then not actually create the kinds of industries that we want. So I think that the answer to your question about where the jobs are going to come from and whether or not they're going to be quality jobs is going to require rethinking how we conceptualize economic policy and focusing on building a strong middle class to create the foundations to do that. And there's a lot there, so I'll pause for a second and ask you to ask a new question, because I could
Peter,
just
go
keep
ahead.
going.
Can I just add,
Please.
again, just a small but really important addition to that, which is this is a racial story
Yes.
as well. And so when we talk about who it is that has disproportionately the worst life possibility, it is the child of color. And that connects to place. You use the word where, Heather, in your sentence quite advisedly, because the issues about race are so concatenated with place, with the inner city, and but also not in terms of the poverty, also Appalachia and Indian reservations and so on. It isn't just urban, but the totality of the schools. I mean, I don't have to make a long thing about it, because we all know the schools that children of color are attending stack things against them. The criminal justice system is waiting to pounce. The cradle to prison pipeline, as my wife has coined that term, and it's now in the general vernacular. And then the issues that happen in these neighborhoods of concentrated poverty about sort of the call of the street, if you will. Elijah Anderson, the great Yale sociologist, called it the war between the decent and the street, where whatever is happening in terms of home or grandma or clergy or whatever it is, there are people on the street saying, "You're not going anywhere. You know, let's sell drugs."
Well, let me put a number on that, if I may. I've been quoting this study every chance I get. There are these economists from the Chicago Booth School of Business and Stanford University who did this very interesting economic analysis that came out at the Annual Economic Association meetings in January, showing that the opening up of professions to women and minorities between 1960 and 2008 contributed 17 to 20% of U.S. economic growth, meaning that the enormous human potential that the United States was not taking advantage of prior to the 1960s, both in terms of women and minorities, once we allowed folks to sort of find where their talents were best suited, added significantly to U.S. economic growth. And we can only imagine that the lure of the street, I mean, it may be that some of the most talented new innovators are, being lured by illicit business opportunities, where if we found ways to bring folks into the formal labor market and give them the kinds of opportunities, that we would be able to make use of that talent, and that would in turn create jobs and grow our economy.
Now, I just want to say here that everything that the two of you are talking about involves spending money, involves increasing the size of government and the level of intervention of government, and that is like so not happening in our current politics. So what I'm wondering is how do you figure out if people even see the need, never mind have the will? I mean, it seems to me that comes way before trying to, figure out how to achieve the sort of assistance in terms of cash assistance and educational assistance and sort of pulling people up. Before that can take place, we have to see a national need. And just because there is a national need doesn't mean we perceive it as something that is our responsibility.
Well, that's certainly a big question.
I thought there weren't going to be tough questions, right?
Yeah, you promised no hard questions. Right now it's just terrible. I mean, nobody's kidding anybody here, and we need to have the largest we can get to defend what we have. It's not just a question of not finding the money to do what we need to do. There's an entire segment of Washington and across the country that wants to do away with what we have. And at the state level, there are governors who want to do the right thing who don't have any money and are having to make cuts, although they try to do them in the least damaging way possible. So the first task is to stand up and say broadly and kind of reach people around the country that Paul Ryan, Congressman Ryan of Wisconsin, and that ilk in the House and proliferating out are just destructive. And the rhetoric is to I think most of us in a room like this is just weird. I mean, it's just fantasy land, because the argument is that all of this stuff, I mean, it's what they said about welfare in the 1990s, that we have to stop helping people so they can get on their own two feet, and that was up to a point correct as long as jobs were available as far as welfare itself was concerned. But now it's the whole thing: Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps. They're all, the whole problem is we're helping people too much. And if we just got rid of it and put them on their own 2 feet, they would behave responsibly, and we'd all be happy ever after. All right, that's now. Going forward, the answer to this, your tough question, is really the American people, and that means a combination of whatever can be done through people who can express themselves through the media to get these points out there. But really, if you look back, my reason for hope is that we've had other times that were really terrible. Certainly at the beginning of the 20th century with the way in which the robber barons held sway in our country. And people stood up and said, this is not acceptable. And the progressive era came, and you can't sort of make the point and say, well, it was particularly this thing that happened. People just got outraged. And they went, there was Teddy Roosevelt and there was leadership, but they voted that way. And that's the heart of it, is making our democracy function. As much money power as there is, and as dangerous as Citizens United is, and it's horrible, the fact is that if people in the middle and the lower middle who are essentially voting against their economic interest now in these elections would simply see the fact that enriching, and Paul Ryan, it's reverse Robin Hood. They want to have more tax cuts. They want to put more money in the pockets of the wealthy. And at the end of the day, we're going to get better outcomes in our democracy if people vote to make them happen.
So there has to be some sort of intersection between compassion and self-interest.
And there is a self-interest, and Heather certainly spoke to that to some extent, but
certainly, I mean, as I was reading this morning's paper and reading about the bailout now in Spain and what's happening in Europe, and thinking about the kind of austerity politics that we're not just seeing here in the United States, but we're seeing abroad, and what the potential implications are for the U.S. economy, and how long we're sort of going to muddle around at 8% unemployment, I think that this question about politics is, I mean, we can't do any of these things unless we have the political will for them. We know from a lot of political science research that the increase in inequality in the United States has been concurrent with an increase of a polarization of U.S. politics, so that the kind of increase in poverty and the spread we've had between rich and poor has not been good for coming to a political consensus on what to do about anything, and the more that we don't do anything, the more it's not actually helping our economy move forward. But we also are at a moment where we've done some things to pull ourselves out of the Great Recession, made some enormous steps forward. We've been adding jobs now for almost 2 years or over 2 years, and we're making a decision now over the next few months here in the United States about what kind of economic policy we want moving forward. Do we want to pare back? Do we want more austerity than we've been doing over the next couple of years, or do we want to continue to invest? And if people make the decision that they want more austerity, it's not going to lead to the kind of job gains or a stronger middle class, which is also what Americans want. So, I mean, I think that this question of when will people wake up and see that an economics that is only for the wealthy doesn't trickle down and doesn't benefit them, and when are they going to start sort of acting on it? We saw some stuff last year with the Occupy and the 99% movement, but I think those are the big questions that I'm sort of waiting to see what people will do. But right now, especially with Citizens United, you've got a lot of misinformation out there, and you've got this guy from Bain Capital, Edward Kennard, out there saying that no, just give all the rich people the money and everything will be just much better, which couldn't be further from the truth. We've seen how that works, but it's really whether or not that captures the imagination of the American people, or whether or not we can say, hey, actually an economy that works for all of us actually will grow faster.
Now, what this, as we sort of rolling through this period, one of the things that you call a special attention to in your book is that there is something called deep poverty, that there is an increasingly large group of people who are so very poor that it's hard to see how they can be lifted out of that kind of poverty, and that will take I mean, that's something that is a lot deeper and more difficult to deal with than people who have troughs in their normal lives. I mean, where they have a married couple where one of them loses a job and they have a period in which they are in a tough spot and then they recover from it. These are people who are finding it increasingly difficult to recover. This is a group where you look at this group and you look at them in 4 years and they're still there. Now, what about them? I mean, do you think that there is anything that this country can do for these people besides help them with cash?
I think we have to differentiate, Linda, between two different problems. One is the astonishing number of people who have incomes below half the poverty line, deep poverty, extreme poverty, up to 20.5 million in 2010. The percentage doubled from 1976. So clearly there's something, a trend, a long-term trend there. So 3.3% up to 6.7% of the American people in 2010. That's one thing. The other thing is persistent and intergenerational poverty, not necessarily deep poverty, but poverty, which is quite bad enough. Overlapping, but two different things. We just literally don't know how people are functioning who have incomes that low. One thing we do know is that most of them actually will not be in deep poverty for very long. That's not to say they're going to get out of poverty. So the number of people who are consistently for year after year down at 6,000, 8,000 for a family of three, some. But so let's kind of distinguish, and so I want to talk about both of those briefly. One of them is just that if there's one person who has an income that's that low, and multiply it by millions, they have to depend. 6 million people get food stamps and only food stamps. It's their only income. I mean, I don't know how one survives on that, except that one way or another, some more are homeless, but they're living with extended family, and that doesn't last, and it's terrible for the children because they're moving around all the time and because there's so much stress and all of that. And the idea that we can't have a safety net that's good enough, I mean, that we actually do know how to do, and it used to be called welfare. Yeah. And it doesn't exist anymore, so that's not so hard in terms of saying what that safety net remedy is. 25 states now have less than 20% of their poor children on welfare, on temporary TANF, temporary assistance for needy families. The state of Wyoming has at last count, 617 people, moms and kids in the whole state, 4% of the poor children in Wyoming. It's unbelievable. The state of Ohio, since John Kasich got elected governor, has reduced the welfare rolls in the continuing recession in human terms, has reduced the welfare rolls by 70,000 people. So in large parts of this country, welfare is just gone. You had 68% of poor children back in the mid-90s. Now you have 27% overall. So the safety net at the very bottom, which ought to be a combination of cash assistance with incentives and help to get off and find a job if there is a job, but ought to be a combination of cash assistance and food stamps. The cash part of that is just gone in large parts of the country. So that actually we know how to fix if we would do it politically. And that's not really getting people out of poverty. That's just getting up to a, some higher level of poverty. Yeah, great. But it's better than the deep poverty. The other part, the persistent and intergenerational, which is what I think you're really getting at, and it's really place-based and it's disproportionately racial, although again it's Appalachia and as well as Ward 8 in Washington. That's so much a combination of different things that have led statistically into some terrible outcomes in those neighborhoods. So you said we have to spend a lot of money, which is true. But in fact, when we get to those communities, there's a huge civic responsibility involved. There's a huge responsibility for leadership. There's a huge responsibility of parents to do everything we can to get them to do a better job with their children. And of course, you have to have jobs available and pathways to jobs, and all these young people, which Heather's written about as well as I have, who are, it's 3 to 5, it's not just cradle to prison pipeline, it's cradle to nowhere pipeline. It's 3 to 5 million young people in this country who for a long period of time have no job and they're not in school. And they're disproportionately African American, Latino, Native American. And if we don't have one thing, it's only one thing, but if we don't have in the high schools clear pathways, alternative pathways, in addition to college preparation, to jobs that you can have with a high school diploma, and particularly that are where it's open to go on to some post-secondary for a certificate, something that's proper preparation for the jobs that you were talking about. That has to be, it's just not there. 21st century career and technical education I have a whole chapter on that in the book, and I feel very strongly about that. I mean, I remember very well the vocational education at vocational high school in Minneapolis when I was growing up. Awful, terrible. It's the image that people have. That's where you shunt the kids that you don't want, and so on and so on. We have examples of that are quite different now. Career academies, the National Academy Foundation in particular, but these things tend to be actually in better schools where you have, they understand that young people don't come in identical packages. And some of the young people will learn better if they can see immediate outcomes in jobs that are open, it's not tracked. But we're not doing that in inner cities. I think that's a huge important step that we could take. And yes, that's money at the local level, but a lot of that is leadership, and it's also people who take responsibility for being role models for kids, particularly in their own community, to say you can do something with yourself, and don't listen to somebody who says otherwise.
I want to be able to turn to the audience for some questions, but let me just say, first of all, that one of the themes of your book, and stated in the title, So Rich, So Poor, is that we do have a huge amount of the wealth of this country concentrated in the hands of a very small number of people. Now, you propose a kind of essentially redistribution of some of that wealth. You propose taxes at pre-Bush tax cut levels for people who are wealthy. Let me start with Heather by just asking you, Heather, as an economist, do you think that if such a thing were possible, which it plainly at the moment isn't, if such a thing were possible, would that be sufficient?
I don't know if it would be sufficient, but it certainly would be a great start. You know, as Peter points out in the book, and as you know, many of us know, the best years for economic growth and for job growth and for wage growth in the past 40 years was in the late 1990s. That was after we raised some taxes, and it's not clear why going back to that tax, those taxes would not. I mean, we certainly couldn't actually, quite frankly, do much worse than we are already. So, you know, let's go back there, and hopefully things will go back to that kind of labor market. You know, we had Joe Stiglitz here on Friday, Nobel laureate economist at Columbia University, and I actually asked him the exact same question. And he said up here on this podium that he thought that going back to higher taxes for the wealthy would be good for economic growth, would be good for the economy. And I, for one, was really glad to hear that, because I think that is true, but it's always nice to have as many Nobel laureates on your side as possible saying the same thing. So I'll just, for all of you who may have missed that, he said he agreed. You know, we have created an economy that is been focused on extracting wealth for those at the very, very top. And if that money was being used only in ways that were improving our productivity and only in ways that were growth enhancing, that might be one thing.
Building manufacturing plants, creating jobs.
But that's not what that money's been doing.
Yachts.
Yeah, not yachts, and not just all going into the financial sector. Finance is enormously important because it creates the flow of funds to allow other people to do things with money, like, you know, create manufacturing plants or invest in other kinds of industries. But to the extent that it is a game in and of itself, and that's where the money is, and they're just extracting money from other sectors, that is not good for our economy. So whatever we can do to help put a lid on that, to go back to the Clinton era tax rates, and to refocus our economy on growth, not extraction, what economists call rent-seeking at the top, that would be good for our economy and would be a great place to start. The other thing that we've talked about here at CAP a little bit is doing a small tax on financial transactions to help reduce speculation. Could raise a lot of money and could help stabilize our economy. But I think making that connection between what's going on in terms of poverty and the middle class and what's going on at the top, this is the same story. And what I'm really glad today that we've been able to pull those together to talk about them as one story, because they really are. And Peter's right, we need to always have in our mind that we can leave no one behind, and we can't do that if we're just saying, if we're only giving our money to the people at the top or
Now,
allowing them to take it.
Peter, we heard in the introduction that you talked about how too many people in the middle class, in your view, are identifying with the rich rather than the rest. And that I know from my experience of many years talking to voters, almost everyone who has a job believes they are in the middle class, even when they're clearly not, even when they're obviously working poor. But how do you make that transition? How do you draw those people back toward the notion that some sort of that help should be on the way for poor people, and that people who are in the middle class should, as you point out, fear for the republic and act accordingly?
I think the political battleground, Linda, we've been kind of saying it implicitly, is above the poverty line in terms of the participation, on up to something on the order of the 70th percentile and so on. In other words, it is the middle and lower middle. And of course, Heather just said what I believe very deeply, which is even as we emphasize the middle to the point where, if I hear it one more time, I'm going to act. The point is all the way down to the bottom. But still, in terms of the battleground, I think it's kind of 20 to 70 or 30 to 70. And it really is about getting them to see where their interest is. It's not a new thing. Remember Thomas Frank's book about whatever happened to Kansas. It's the same point. There was more social issues in the conversation at that point. But people have this sense, and it's understandably hard to dislodge that their children are going to do better than they did. That to some extent they are where they are because that's their own failing, or it's because that's the way things are, and there's a sort of a sense of resignation about it. So that if we have a combination of political leadership and people through the various media who are making these points that we're making this morning, that's what we have to do. And I think basically we need the kind of people saying enough already. Too much money flowing into politics, but it doesn't matter how much money because we get it and we're going to go out and vote, and we're going to vote in our own economic self-interest this time. Now, bottom line, how am I going to make that happen? All I can say is it's everybody here, and it's everybody we ever talk to who has to be energized and participate in every possible way.
Questions? right nearest to me, the lady in the scarf and the glasses.
We have, this is to all of you, and it's just a pointing up of things you've been talking about for the last 45 minutes. We have an election to win, and it's going to be very hard. And what do you think we can expect our side to say at best and end up with 50.1% of the vote?
I'll just say, Celia, that I think, and I'm confident that President Obama will talk to the American people about what's been accomplished with his leadership, which is a pretty long list of important things. Heather talked about some of them, but it's a much longer list as well. And he needs to tell the American people that this has been a time that has made a huge difference in a positive way against great odds for our people.
In the U.S. right here, in the blazer.
My name is Ron Fisher, and my outfit is WeThePeopleNow.org. And Charles Ferguson's book, Predator Nation, explains pretty well what's happened. And what basically with productivity today, there's just not enough jobs to go around the way it's been worked. But the corporations and the financial industry, and he calls it a criminal enterprise, has not done anything. He recommends prosecutions, as I do also. But what has really happened is they didn't lower the price of anything. They kept their profits up. They pay minimum wages. Consequently, now the 2,000 largest corporations have $149 trillion, up 11 trillion from last year. And for example, we could have a property tax. Now, they're not going to do that because they're bribing Congress into this.
Did
So
you have a
what I would
question?
ask you about is, what do you think of criminal prosecutions for the financial industry and a property tax on their, and some of the congressmen that have passed these laws? Thank you.
Passed which laws?
Don't encourage it.
Oh, okay. Well, just personally, I have to say to you that I've been troubled by the lack of criminal prosecutions among some of the leadership of the major banks and financial institutions. So I don't speak as an expert on it, but I know Charles Ferguson's work, many of us do, and he's obviously not the only one saying that, so you could add my voice to that point.
There's a lot of documentation in this book about money not lent, profits held onto, expansion does not occur, that sort of thing. So there's a tremendous amount of amazing information compressed into this slender volume here. And
It expands, actually, when you open it up.
I find
it's a complete magic trick.
I find it very impressive how much Peter has crowded into it. Yes, in the hat, the lady in the hat.
That's how she's known, actually. Those
Yes.
of you who
That's
know
how I'm
her.
known. Nobody knows my name. Diana Pierce from the University of Washington, Seattle. Whenever I write or write an op-ed or anything like that, what people jump on is those single mothers. They shouldn't have had the children if they can't afford to do it. We saw the same thing with welfare reform and a racialization of that as well. And so deflects from what the real issues are. And in the work that we were talking about earlier that I've done, 85% of people that are below a poverty standard that's a little bit higher than, but they're working, or they have somebody in the household who is working. So and half those people are working full-time year-round. Most people are maxed out in terms of work. And if you look at, even if they added another 15% hours, so they were totally maxed out, the problem is wages. It's low wages. I agree that some of it is not being able to take a day off because of, because your kid is sick. But the main problem is the wages have stagnated, and a single parent cannot support a family. A single wage cannot support a family. But it gets blamed. We deflect from the issue of the fact that productivity has risen, wages have not tracked with that, costs are rising, and we deflect from that by blaming it. Oh, it's because she's trying to support a family by herself. She shouldn't have done that. And so it becomes an issue that is, gendered and racialized. So how do you respond? How do we get out of that box and get the conversation back to wages?
It's a struggle, as you know, Diana, of many decades duration. The attack, really it's an attack on women and children that's gone on since the late 1960s that resulted in the 1996 welfare law. Fact is that the number of children being born to moms who aren't married has gone up all over the world. And it's gone up among all racial groups. And we don't exactly know why. I mean, some change in mores and so on. Other fact is that the number of births to African American women who are not married is quite high. It's 70%. I don't think that's a good thing, personally, although case by case, we certainly don't want to paint with a broad brush. But I think that's it's a separate issue, and it's an issue that there are some things that people are doing to make a difference in terms of especially with young people, to get them to see that really there's a life of opportunity that's there for them if they'll take it and not have a child too young. But the politics of it is tough, remains tough, and I think that we just have to keep at it and saying, look, whatever the situation is, when you get to the economics of it, it's just horrible. And you restated it, we stated it. So I wish I had a good answer, but that is an extremely, you know, they're still saying that there are all these people who are out there living on the welfare system, and, you know, the numbers are less than 1.5% of the American people. The numbers are barely over 4 million people when it was 14 million, which I think was too high in 1994. And where it's been useless in the recession, food stamps went from 26.3 million in 2007 to 46 million now, because people have a legal right to it. And the politicians, now they want to say, well, food stamps is the new welfare, so we've got to destroy that. We've got to turn it into a block grant where there won't be any legal right to it. So we just have to hold up our end of the argument.
Did you want to add something?
Well, I think the only thing I would add, Diana, is, I mean, it's a really good question, and you're seeing that kind of ideology playing out. We've seen it all spring, you know, as we've been tracking how issues around women in work have been framed more generally. And I, for one, was really disappointed that the Senate chose again to not they chose again to not pass the Paycheck Fairness Act, not because I thought it would pass the House and that it would get into law, but that it sort of showed that, wow, you know, women continue to make 77 cents on the dollar. A core piece of the legislation is that it would just allow people to know what their colleagues earn. So right now, millions of people don't have the right to ask, you know, what the person sitting next to them in the cubicle is making. And if you don't know how much the guy next to you is making, you don't know that you're being discriminated against. There's very, like, you know, simple ways that we could do something to help boost wages, especially for women and for people who are afraid of losing their jobs. And yet that's, you know, transparency and the free market is something that evidently doesn't apply when it comes to workers' wages. So, I mean, I think it's frustrating, but it's not just about poor women. There's really been this all-out attack on working women more generally, and it's frightening, especially when the majority of mothers are breadwinners or co-burners for their families.
Now, I think this is going to be the last question unless I decide that it isn't. Do you, let's say, way in the back? Was there somebody with their hand up way in the back? Yes. There you go.
Thanks. My name is Elisa Minoff, and I actually had the pleasure of working with Peter on CAP's Poverty Task Force 5 years ago. And my question was about the relationship between public discourse and policy change. And I wanted to ask this of Peter because one of the things that the reasons why CAP originally had the task force and continues to work on this Half in 10 campaign is to make people start thinking about poverty and talking about poverty in the broader world and outside of think tanks in Washington. And there's this assumption behind that work that thinking and talking about poverty is important to get legislation passed that will help poor people. And I'm now working on my dissertation and thinking a lot about social policy in the 1960s when Peter started working. And what's striking when I think about the 1960s is that when the war on poverty, it was the legislation that seemed to start people talking about poverty. Before 1964, people were talking about depressed areas, they're talking about problems in cities, but it was Johnson in his legislation in that great speech where he talks about the war on poverty, that poverty became kind of a watchword, and people started using it a lot. So in that case, it seemed as though the legislation was helping drive the discourse. And I'm wondering, Peter, in your experience since the 1960s, do you think that there are distinct examples where talking about poverty outside of think tanks, outside of sort of social welfare expert circles in Washington, has led to policy change that really has helped poor people?
The first thing, Elisa.
Why did you write this book, Mr. Edelman?
Yeah. Right. Is that just to say, as Heather and I both should have said, the half and 10 work that CAP is doing is absolutely sensational. For those of you who don't know it, look on the website, look at what Melissa Boteach and everybody on the staff is doing about that, because that is about framing these issues in ways that will catch people's attention. On the larger question, I have to say that I'm kind of two minds. One is what I really believe and hope, and the other is what I think turns out to be sort of a practical fact. The thing that I believe and want to see happen is that the P word, as I call it in the book, that poverty should get back into the discourse. And so on the one hand, I think, and as Heather and I both said, and many of you strongly believe, President Obama has, with Congress, done a large amount for low-income people, starting with the stimulus legislation and 16 million people added to Medicaid, who are basically poor or slightly above the poverty line, 18 to 64-year-old adults, and a race to the top, which is whatever you think about the policy, is about low-income children. But the P word is not much in evidence. And so one part of my brain says we really need to just call out the word and put it out there in the discussion. The other part is, go back to those 40 million people who are not in poverty because of the things that we have done. And those things all have other names. Social Security, hunger, health care, housing, education. People are, and there's lots of polling data on this, unfortunately for my P word argument, that people respond much better when you talk about a specific problem. So at least my experience, Alyssa, which I don't think is very profound or different from others, is that factually, in the world we live in, we do better vis-a-vis these things when we talk about the particular problem that we're addressing. People are more responsive.
Do you suppose it's a question of degree? I mean, if the levels of poverty are rising, at that point you're looking at something which should just be called what it is?
Linda, the deep poverty question has got to just be addressed. The idea that there's 6 million people who only have food stamps for an income. I don't know any word for that except abject poverty. So yes.
We're past our deadline, and I think we're gonna call it at that. But thank you all very, very much for coming, and thank you for your questions. And Peter, Heather,
Thank you,
thank
Linda.
you all very much.
And thank you, Linda.
Yeah, thank you.